We're living in a time where our technology is more connected than ever, but that also means we're more vulnerable than ever to disruptions from space. Right now, scientists are raising alarms about an incredibly unusual phenomenon happening on the sun's sunspots. Those dark spots on the solar surface are increasing in number and intensity, and the solar storm activity associated with them is sparking global concerns. Could this solar chaos be the next threat to our fragile power grids and global communication systems? Let's dive into what's going on and why experts are sounding the alarm. So, sunspots are not just some pretty cosmic curiosities. They are massive eruptions of magnetic energy on the sun's surface. These sunspots are linked to solar flares and coronal mass ejections, CMEs, which are incredibly powerful bursts of energy and particles sent into space. And here's the thing, our technology on Earth is extremely sensitive to these solar storms. The reality is, we've been living on borrowed time. Scientists are predicting a solar maximum, which is a peak in solar activity, is coming soon. And the sun's behavior right now is raising all kinds of red flags. One of the biggest concerns scientists have right now is the intensity of the sunspot activity. For the past few decades, we've seen a relatively quiet sun, but all that is changing. In recent years, the sun has been showing signs of increased sunspot activity, and this is expected to intensify as we approach the peak of solar cycle 25. These solar cycles typically last about 11 years, and we're nearing the point where the sun's activity will be at its highest. As sunspots grow more numerous and active, the risk of major solar flares and CMEs becomes much higher. The question now is just how bad it could get. Let's take a step back and look at why these solar storms are so concerning. Solar flares release massive amounts of radiation and energy that travel toward Earth at nearly the speed of light. These bursts of energy can interfere with communication systems, GPS signals, and even power grids. But it's the coronal mass ejections, those gigantic clouds of charged particles, that could do the real damage. When a CME hits Earth, it interacts with our magnetic field, creating a phenomenon known as the geomagnetic storm. These storms can knock out satellites, disrupt radio signals, and even fry electrical circuits. In the worst-case scenario, a massive solar storm could cause a global blackout, something experts are starting to take very seriously. And that's where our power grids come into play. We rely on electricity for almost everything, from lighting our homes to running critical infrastructure like hospitals, airports, and even military operations. If a solar storm of significant magnitude were to hit, it could induce massive voltage surges in power lines and transformers. These surges would damage or destroy transformers, key components in the power grid, and this could take weeks, months, or even years to repair. The problem is, our modern power grid is interconnected across continents, and a failure in one region could cause a domino effect, knocking out power worldwide. Just imagine, no electricity for days or even weeks, widespread food shortages, and communication breakdowns. The impact on communication could be just as catastrophic. Modern society is built on instant connectivity. When the internet goes down, when GPS fails, and when communication satellites are knocked out, chaos follows. The reliance on space-based technology for everything from military operations to weather forecasts means that even a short disruption could have devastating effects. It's not just about losing access to Netflix or social media. Imagine global trade grinding to a halt, air traffic being grounded, or military assets being rendered blind. It could be the kind of catastrophic event that we're just not prepared for. In fact, this isn't just a hypothetical situation. Back in 1859, the Carrington event, the largest solar storm on record, caused telegraph systems to catch fire, sparked massive auroras visible as far south as the Caribbean, and demonstrated just how much solar storms can disrupt our technology. Thankfully, we were not nearly as reliant on electrical systems back then, but today, we live in a different world. If a solar event like Carrington were to happen today, it could cost trillions of dollars and throw the world into a state of chaos. To make matters worse, our power grids have become increasingly vulnerable over the years. Aging infrastructure, over-reliance on a centralized system, and the growing complexity of interconnected grids all mean that a solar storm could exploit weaknesses in ways that we're just not prepared for. These vulnerabilities are starting to show, with some regions already experiencing occasional outages due to solar activity. Some experts suggest that our grids are too fragile for a massive solar storm, and we're risky close to catastrophe if one were to hit. So, what's being done to protect our power grids? Unfortunately, not enough. While some countries like the US and Canada have taken steps to fortify their power grids against geomagnetic storms, the global infrastructure is still woefully underprepared. Many experts argue that the threat of a large-scale solar storm is something that needs to be addressed on a global level, yet there are still no universally agreed-upon standards for protecting power grids from these solar threats. Much of the research being done is focused on better predicting solar storms, but there's little in place when it comes to preventing or mitigating the effects of these storms. And the clock is ticking. As we edge closer to the peak of solar cycle 25, experts are urging governments and private sector players to invest in hardening our power grids, improving early warning systems, and developing more resilient infrastructure. With the growing concerns over sunspot activity and the potential for massive solar storms, the time to act is now. But even with the best-case scenario in terms of preparedness, there's always going to be that element of uncertainty. The sun is unpredictable. It's a vast, mysterious entity that operates on timescales that are difficult to comprehend. What we know for certain is that the sunspots and their resulting solar storms are an undeniable threat to the modern world as we know it. As we continue to advance technologically and become more reliant on electricity, it's crucial to start thinking about how we'll cope with an event that could shut down everything we take for granted. A major solar storm is not just some far-off possibility, it's a real risk, and the more we learn about the sun, the better we can prepare for the inevitable. Whether or not we're ready to face it is another matter entirely. The truth is, while we sit on the edge of our seats, waiting for the next solar maximum, we must understand that this isn't something that will happen out of the blue. We've already seen the early warning signs. As solar activity increases, we're seeing more sunspots, and with those, a noticeable uptick in solar flare activity. These flares aren't just minor blips, they're enormous bursts of energy. Some of them have the power to knock out satellites in orbit, disrupt radio communication, and send charged particles deep into Earth's atmosphere, interfering with everything from GPS signals to aviation. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The core of the issue with solar storms is how these energetic bursts can disrupt the electromagnetic fields around the Earth. Normally, Earth's magnetic field acts like a protective shield, diverting most of the solar wind and particles away from our planet. However, when a massive CME hits, it can cause a severe geomagnetic storm. The geomagnetic field gets disturbed, and that's where the trouble starts. These disturbances can cause voltage surges in power lines, leading to cascading failures. And this is exactly what happened back in 1989 when the Quebec blackout occurred, following a solar storm. This blackout lasted 9 hours, and it was felt across a huge region. If a storm of that magnitude were to strike today, the consequences could be far more catastrophic, especially considering how much more dependent we are on electricity now. There's also something to consider when we talk about satellite infrastructure. A solar storm's high-energy particles can damage the delicate electronic circuits in satellites, potentially rendering them inoperable. Imagine the global impact of losing weather satellites that help us predict storms, hurricanes, and even agriculture conditions. Losing communication satellites would mean total blackouts in communication. We'd be unable to contact people in remote areas, potentially causing logistical nightmares for everything from disaster relief efforts to military operations. The possibility of losing access to global positioning systems, GPS, which are integral to shipping, aviation, and many everyday navigation systems, is also very real. A solar storm could create havoc on a scale we've never experienced before. But it's not just power grids and satellites we have to worry about. If you've been following the latest news on global climate change, then you know that we're already dealing with some extreme weather patterns that are only getting worse. It's possible that solar storms could exacerbate these challenges. Think about it. If a massive solar event causes widespread electrical failures, communication breakdowns, and disruptions to global supply chains, the climate emergency we're already facing could become even harder to tackle. Governments and organizations might struggle to provide basic services and address growing environmental disasters. The knock-on effect of these storms could reach every corner of the globe, turning a bad situation even worse. The good news is that scientists are becoming increasingly sophisticated in predicting solar activity. We have advanced space weather satellites now that can monitor the sun and its activity in real time. Tools like the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, SOHO, which has been monitoring the sun for over 25 years, give us valuable insights into the sun's behavior and allow us to better forecast solar storms. We've also developed models that help us predict when solar activity will peak. These advancements are helpful, but they don't remove the fact that we can't truly predict the intensity or impact of these events. Solar storms can sometimes occur with little warning, and with current technology, we are still a bit behind in terms of protection. What can we do to protect ourselves from this ever-growing threat? Some countries are already taking steps to protect their power grids from solar-induced damage. In the US, for example, the Department of Energy has been working on strategies to protect the grid and improve resilience. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, is working on better forecasting systems that will give us more warning time. But here's the kicker: these efforts are still in the early stages, and the clock is ticking. The inevitable solar storm is coming, and we need to ramp up efforts to harden our grids and infrastructure to withstand it. Without that, we'll be left vulnerable, completely exposed to the whims of the sun. One approach to mitigate the damage is underground power lines. In areas prone to solar storms, burying electrical cables deep underground could shield them from the electromagnetic pulses caused by solar flares. Another measure could be developing better shielding for satellites, ensuring that space infrastructure can withstand the high-energy particles that come with solar storms. But as with most global challenges, the best approach will require international cooperation. This isn't something that can be solved by one country or one sector of society. We need a global strategy to address this threat head-on. And we can't forget about the human element. While much of the talk around solar storms focuses on infrastructure, the effects on society, on everyday life, are just as concerning. In a modern world where electricity is the lifeblood of nearly every sector, a prolonged outage could create severe disruptions to healthcare systems, emergency services, and daily commerce. Hospitals rely on constant power to keep life-saving equipment running. If the power goes out for an extended period, we could see a breakdown in the healthcare system at a time when people need it most. It's not just about losing the light switch or the refrigerator, it's about the very fabric of modern life unraveling. It's also worth considering how space weather can affect military operations. The military has long relied on space-based assets for everything from navigation to reconnaissance. A disruption in these systems could leave countries vulnerable to unforeseen challenges, including threats from other nations or rogue actors. Cybersecurity could also become a major issue if solar storms damage systems that defend against cyber attacks. There's a lot more at stake here than we might realize. When it comes down to it, the sun holds a tremendous power over our planet. We often think of it as a stable force in the universe, but solar activity is anything but predictable. While we can't control the sun, we can control how we prepare for the inevitable. The question is, are we ready for the chaos that's coming? As we've seen in the past, solar storms are not just theoretical threats. They've already happened, and their effects have been felt by humanity. One of the most famous examples is the Carrington event of 1859, which is considered the largest solar storm on record. During this event, a massive coronal mass ejection, CME, hit Earth, and the results were staggering. Telegraph systems across the world were completely disrupted, and in some cases, telegraph wires even caught fire due to the electrical surges caused by the solar particles. What's even more alarming is that the technology we depend on today, our satellites, communication systems, and power grids, would be far more vulnerable than what was in place in 1859. The truth is, The Carrington event wasn't even as powerful as some of the solar storms that scientists predict could occur in the future. If a solar storm of that magnitude were to hit today, we would be looking at catastrophic global consequences. A modern-day Carrington event could easily knock out satellites, disrupt communications, and even cause long-lasting power grid failures. The cost could be astronomical. Some estimates suggest that a major solar storm could cause up to $2 trillion in damages in the United States alone. That's an amount so large it's hard to even comprehend, especially when you think about how far-reaching the effects would be. With everything from banking systems to airline navigation relying on satellites, the global economy could come to a screeching halt. It's important to note that the frequency of these storms has been increasing. The Sun has an 11-year solar cycle, during which solar activity waxes and wanes. Right now, we're entering a period of heightened activity, known as solar maximum. During solar maximum, the Sun's magnetic field flips, and it generates an increase in sunspots and solar flares. This period of heightened activity raises the likelihood of stronger solar storms, and as the solar cycle progresses, we may see even more powerful flares and CMEs that could disrupt life as we know it. But here's the kicker: while we know the solar cycle has a pattern, the exact timing and intensity of these storms are still unpredictable. Even though scientists have made huge strides in monitoring solar activity, it's still incredibly difficult to predict when or how destructive a solar flare or CME will be. The problem with solar storms is that, much like earthquakes, we can't reliably forecast them. We can see the early signs, a rising number of sunspots, or the swelling of solar prominences, but those are just indicators. What we don't know is whether those early warning signs will lead to a huge eruption or whether the storm will be mild. That's where we really start to get into the preparation issue. As we've seen, the threat of solar storms isn't just something we should be concerned about in the distant future, it's a present danger. Even though scientists are doing what they can to develop better forecasting techniques and early warning systems, our infrastructure is nowhere near ready for a full-scale solar storm. If you think about how fragile the global power grid is, it's shocking that we haven't made more headway in addressing this threat. If we look at the power grid vulnerability in places like the United States, the infrastructure is old, stretched thin, and massively interconnected. A single large-scale solar storm could send massive electrical surges through the grid, causing transformer failures, damaging equipment, and leaving entire regions without power for months, maybe even years. Imagine that, months without electricity in some of the most densely populated areas in the world. Power outages of that scale would have devastating consequences. We would see massive disruptions in healthcare, manufacturing, and transportation. More importantly, emergency services would be severely hampered, and countries would be unable to provide essential services. Think about how much we rely on electricity just to run our basic day-to-day operations, our hospitals, fire departments, and even the ability to communicate in emergencies. When you lose that, society starts to unravel. And it's not just about having lights go out. We're talking about critical systems failing. Food production could be affected, as refrigeration systems would be down. Gas stations wouldn't be able to pump fuel. Air traffic control systems would go offline. Planes would be grounded. The global economy could suffer a blow that it might not recover from for a long time. The worst part is that it's not just the US that would be affected. The entire world would feel the impact of a solar storm. Developing countries, which rely heavily on external support and infrastructure, could face even worse conditions. The lack of modern infrastructure in these regions makes it even harder to recover from an event of this magnitude. In the most remote areas, we might see a total collapse of communication systems, meaning emergency aid would struggle to reach those who need it most. So, as solar maximum approaches, we need to ask ourselves, are we really prepared? We've seen how even smaller solar storms have damaged satellites, disrupted communications, and caused power outages. But we've been lucky. A major storm hasn't hit yet, and we continue to rely on outdated infrastructure that could crumble under the pressure of an intense solar event. While there's still time to take action, the clock is ticking, and the world's reliance on electrical systems is only growing. It's not just the power grids that we need to worry about. Satellites, which are crucial for everything from weather forecasting to global communications, are vulnerable to solar storms. These storms can fry electronics in space, leading to a temporary or permanent loss of satellites. In fact, a large solar storm could destroy a significant portion of our satellites, knocking out everything from GPS systems to weather forecasting capabilities. Without satellites, communication between countries could become nearly impossible, and global trade could grind to a halt. It's time we start thinking seriously about the long-term resilience of our infrastructure and our ability to survive in a world increasingly dependent on technology. The clock is ticking, and the solar storm of the century could strike at any moment. Will we be ready? The answer to that question may determine whether we emerge from the storm intact or whether we face a global catastrophe that takes years, even decades, to recover from. As the solar maximum approaches, the growing concerns about solar storms are becoming more apparent. We've touched on the potential power grid failures, but another aspect that's rarely discussed is the impact of solar storms on communication systems. When a large solar flare releases a massive amount of energy, it sends out high-energy particles into space, which can travel millions of miles before impacting Earth. These particles are capable of penetrating Earth's magnetic shield and interacting with our technological infrastructure. Satellites, which are used for everything from global communication to financial transactions, are especially vulnerable to these energetic bursts. A solar storm can disable a satellite's onboard electronics, causing malfunctions or, in some cases, permanent damage. This isn't a theoretical problem, it's happened before. In 2003, a powerful solar storm disabled several satellites, including those used for weather forecasting and GPS. The 2003 Halloween solar storm, as it was called, was a wake-up call for scientists and engineers. However, the damage was still relatively contained because our dependence on satellite technology wasn't as extensive as it is today. Imagine, however, if the next massive solar storm were to hit in an era where everything relies on satellite technology. Global communications, navigation systems, banking, and even defense would all be on the line. Global positioning systems, GPS, for example, are used in nearly every modern-day vehicle, from cars to airplanes. A solar storm could knock out the GPS network, creating chaos in transportation systems worldwide. Airplanes, which depend on satellites for navigation, would suddenly be flying blind. Ships on the ocean could lose their ability to communicate or navigate, leading to accidents and possible maritime disasters. In fact, the airline industry could be hit harder than any other, as thousands of flights would be delayed or canceled due to the disruption of navigation systems. The effects on the global economy could be immediate and devastating. And don't think that Earth is the only place at risk. A solar storm's impact on satellites could affect communications between Earth and spacecraft. This could interrupt missions to the International Space Station, Mars rovers, or other satellite missions. If Earth's own communication grid fails, astronauts or researchers in space might find themselves stranded without a way to communicate back to Earth. A solar storm could also damage the electronics on these spacecraft, delaying critical scientific research or even causing permanent failure. But it doesn't stop with satellites. There's the threat to space exploration and all those projects we've been building to push the boundaries of human understanding. With the increasing space race and exploration missions to Mars, the Moon, and beyond, the need to protect our space infrastructure is becoming critical. Imagine a scenario where a solar storm wipes out years of progress in satellite launches or delays an entire crewed mission to Mars. It's not just technology at risk, it's the future of human exploration. Furthermore, high-frequency communication systems, such as those used by militaries around the world, are extremely vulnerable to solar storms. These communication systems rely on radio waves, and solar activity can cause radio interference that could disrupt these critical systems. Military operations could be delayed, or in the worst-case scenario, lead to communication blackouts during vital operations. The geopolitical implications of this are immense. Countries relying on military communication could face significant strategic setbacks, while simultaneously dealing with civil unrest caused by other effects of a large solar storm. This is especially concerning for nations involved in space exploration, which could find themselves isolated from each other if a massive solar storm were to knock out their satellite infrastructure. But let's focus on the global power grid again. A large-scale solar storm wouldn't just disrupt electrical infrastructure, it would destroy it. Think about it. Our power grids today are interwoven, meaning a problem in one part of the world can quickly affect other regions. Solar storms send electromagnetic pulses, EMPs, that could overload the transformers that regulate power distribution. These transformers are difficult and expensive to replace, and if they were to burn out on a global scale, it could leave large swaths of the planet in the dark for weeks, months, or even longer. Take, for example, the 1994 Quebec blackout in Canada. A minor solar storm caused the entire Quebec power grid to shut down, leaving 6 million people without power for 9 hours. It wasn't a huge solar flare, but the electromagnetic pulse from the storm caused transformers to fail, leading to a power outage that disrupted everything. Now, imagine what would happen if a solar storm 10 times more powerful than that struck Earth today, when power grids are much more complex and interconnected. It's not just about a few hours of inconvenience. Power outages of this scale could trigger a cascade of failures across the economy. For example, grocery stores would be unable to keep food cold, causing widespread food shortages. Banking systems would be offline, making digital transactions impossible. Hospitals might lose power, risking lives. The water supply in many regions relies on electric pumps, meaning people could be without access to clean water. Emergency services would be paralyzed, making it impossible to respond to natural disasters or other emergencies. The ripple effect from one massive solar storm would be unprecedented, and its effects could linger for years. We have to ask ourselves, if a solar storm of this magnitude hits tomorrow, will we be ready? Will our global systems be able to recover? The unfortunate reality is that we're not prepared. Power grids are outdated, and even with technological advances, the infrastructure isn't built to withstand a large-scale solar storm. As climate change continues to disrupt our global systems, the situation only becomes more pressing. If solar storms are on the rise, it's crucial that we take steps now to harden our infrastructure and develop better forecasting models. The future of human civilization could depend on it. The more we understand the potential risks posed by solar storms, the clearer it becomes that our technological dependence is both a blessing and a curse. While these technologies have improved life in countless ways, they also make us more vulnerable to disruptions from forces beyond our control. This is especially true as we delve deeper into solar activity and the kinds of events that could change the game. One of the things that scientists are now increasingly worried about is the timing and frequency of solar storms. Historically, we've seen solar cycles that peak roughly every 11 years, with periods of intense solar activity followed by calmer phases. However, scientists have begun to notice a troubling pattern emerging. The intensity and frequency of sunspot activity appear to be rising in ways that defy traditional models. Recent studies have shown that the sun is entering a phase of heightened activity, potentially leading to more frequent and stronger solar storms. As the sun's activity increases, geomagnetic storms, which are essentially solar wind that can disturb Earth's magnetic field, are becoming more intense. Geomagnetic storms are the precursors to solar flares and coronal mass ejections, CMEs, which we've already established can be catastrophic for the power grid and communications. These storms have the ability to interfere with satellite orbits, cause navigation errors in planes, and disrupt electric grid transformers. The truth is, we don't have enough data to predict exactly when these massive events will hit. They could strike at any moment, and given how interconnected our global systems are, even a seemingly minor storm can have ripple effects. Imagine this scenario. Power grids around the world are interconnected through complex high-voltage transmission lines, which deliver electricity across vast distances. These lines can be exposed to intense solar winds during a solar storm, and the resulting surge can trigger blackouts in multiple countries at the same time. The implications of a multi-country blackout are staggering. Supply chains would break down almost immediately, leaving grocery stores and pharmacies empty in a matter of hours. At the same time, hospitals would struggle to keep their life-saving equipment running, and emergency response teams would be unable to function due to communication failures. This cascading effect would lead to societal disruption, and recovery could take months or even years. While we often think of solar storms as a risk to electronics or infrastructure, they also pose a significant threat to human health. The radiation from a massive solar flare can reach the Earth's surface in the form of high-energy particles. These particles can harm astronauts in space, aviators flying at high altitudes, and even those on the ground. For example, during intense solar activity, the amount of cosmic radiation in the atmosphere increases, which can increase the risk of cancer and other illnesses for people who are frequently exposed to this radiation. The airline industry could be forced to reroute planes away from the polar regions, where radiation levels are highest during solar storms. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. Another, often overlooked consequence of intense solar flares is the potential impact on our telecommunications infrastructure. Today, we rely heavily on radio waves, which are vulnerable to disruption during solar storms. High-frequency radio signals are used by the military, aviation, and maritime industries, but they can be distorted or even completely blocked by solar flares. Think about it. Airlines rely on radio signals for air traffic control and weather updates, and military operations often depend on secure radio communications for coordination. A massive solar flare could shut down these communication lines in an instant, creating an environment where military operations and commercial flights are both at risk. Moreover, countries with less developed infrastructure may be hit harder, as they may not have the technological resources to rapidly recover from these disruptions. We must also consider the economic ramifications of widespread power outages and disruptions to telecommunications. As we've already discussed, if the grid goes down, the consequences will extend far beyond just power outages. Global supply chains could come to a halt. The financial system would be crippled, with transactions frozen or delayed for weeks. Stock markets could experience massive fluctuations, and many businesses would face financial collapse due to the inability to process payments or continue operations. Think about how quickly things can spiral out of control in today's hyper-connected world. We rely on digital systems to run our economies, from processing payments to managing logistics, and a massive solar storm could grind all of that to a halt. For countries with less robust infrastructure, the humanitarian crisis could be even worse. Imagine regions where clean water isn't available without electricity, where hospitals rely on electrical equipment for life support, and where communication is vital for coordinating aid during natural disasters. When a solar storm takes out these critical systems, it could lead to widespread displacement and civil unrest as people struggle to survive without the basic necessities. The ripple effect on global migration could be catastrophic, as millions of people may flee regions that no longer have power, water, or basic services. Now, let's touch on the preparation side of things. While there have been some advancements in shielding critical infrastructure, the fact is that we're still far behind. Governments around the world have invested heavily in defending against cyber attacks or terrorist threats, but the risk from solar storms is largely ignored. There are no global protocols in place for dealing with the aftermath of a major solar event. At best, we have a few localized contingency plans to protect certain grid systems, but even those would struggle in the face of a superstorm. For us to be truly ready, we would need to harden the entire global grid, not just patch up certain weak spots. Power transformers would need to be reinforced to withstand the kind of solar-induced electromagnetic pulses that have the potential to knock them out. We would also need to invest in backup systems for communication, healthcare, and transportation, so that in the event of a massive solar storm, vital systems could continue operating even if the main infrastructure fails. Satellite-based communication could provide an alternative during a crisis, but the satellite infrastructure itself would need to be protected from damage caused by intense solar radiation. The key takeaway here is that the threat from solar activity is real and imminent. The good news is that we have time to prepare, but the clock is ticking. The more we understand the risks, the better we can protect ourselves and our systems. However, the question remains, will we take this warning seriously, or will we wait until the solar storm hits to start making real changes? As the sun's activity continues to ramp up, experts are urging global leaders to take action now before we face the catastrophic consequences of a massive solar storm. But here's the catch. Preparing for a solar storm isn't like preparing for a natural disaster like an earthquake or a hurricane. The unpredictability of solar activity makes it far more difficult to plan for. Unlike earthquakes, which occur with known fault lines and predictable seismic behavior, solar storms don't have a clear, easily understood timeline or warning signs. Space weather scientists are working to improve forecasting, but as of now, predicting when a solar storm will hit with precision is still a major challenge. In fact, many scientists have pointed out that we might not even be aware of the full scope of the risk solar activity poses. Sure, we've had some major solar flares and geomagnetic storms in recent decades, but they pale in comparison to what could happen during the peak of a particularly intense solar cycle. And this peak could be just around the corner. Solar Cycle 25, which started in December 2019, is expected to peak in 2025, and it's already showing signs of being more intense than previous cycles. There are predictions that massive solar flares could occur during this cycle, with the potential to cause widespread disruptions to Earth's technology. One of the biggest problems with the current level of preparedness is the underestimation of the potential scale of a solar storm. Many of the existing infrastructure systems were built long before we fully understood the power of space weather. The current power grid infrastructure was designed to withstand the typical day-to-day challenges, like weather-related outages or localized blackouts, not planet-wide disruptions caused by a massive solar event. We've come a long way in terms of technology and electricity transmission, but we haven't updated our systems to account for the kinds of damage that solar storms can cause. Power grids are especially vulnerable. When a geomagnetic storm hits, it generates intense electric currents that flow through the Earth's magnetic field and into our power lines. These currents can cause transformers to overheat and fail, interrupting the flow of electricity for days, weeks, or even months in some areas. Replacing these damaged transformers is a major undertaking, as they can be quite large, expensive, and often take time to manufacture. During an intense solar event, multiple countries could suffer simultaneous blackouts, making it even harder to restore power. The ripple effects of these power outages would be felt everywhere. We live in a world where electricity is the backbone of nearly every system. Transportation networks, water systems, medical facilities, and even basic food production rely on electricity. Without it, society would grind to a halt. That's why experts believe the consequences of a major solar storm could be so much more severe than most people realize. It's not just about losing power for a few hours or days. We're talking about potential long-term blackouts, supply chain disruptions, and global economic repercussions. Governments and businesses around the world have already started to plan for cyber attacks and other man-made threats, but solar storms are still, for the most part, an afterthought. There's also the impact on space-based technologies, which are becoming increasingly vital to our daily lives. Satellite systems for communications, navigation, and weather forecasting could be severely affected by solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These solar particles can damage satellite electronics and disrupt services. In fact, GPS systems are already known to be vulnerable to solar flares, especially in the higher latitudes. A large-scale solar storm could cause widespread GPS outages, affecting everything from military operations to aviation and shipping. And let's not forget that our financial system is also heavily reliant on satellite communication. If satellite systems go offline, the entire global economy could suffer as transactions become delayed or even impossible. So what can we do to protect ourselves from the devastating effects of solar storms? While we're not powerless, our options are currently limited. There are steps that can be taken to harden our infrastructure against space weather, such as reinforcing power grid components, installing surge protectors, and improving the resilience of satellite communication systems. Some countries are even exploring the idea of building underground power lines that would be less susceptible to solar-induced electromagnetic pulses. These steps, while helpful, are far from a complete solution. A full-scale global response to solar storm threats would require coordination across countries and industries. The International Space Weather Initiative, launched by the United Nations in 2018, is one of the first international efforts to tackle space weather risks. The goal of the initiative is to create a global framework for understanding and mitigating the effects of space weather, including solar storms. However, the initiative is still in its early stages, and it remains to be seen whether it can achieve the kind of widespread cooperation needed to protect global infrastructure from solar threats. Meanwhile, the urgency of the problem is growing. Space weather scientists are working to improve solar storm forecasting and create early warning systems that could give us a few hours' notice before a massive solar event hits. This would allow governments to take action, such as shutting down power grids and grounding flights, to minimize damage. However, even with early warning systems, there's only so much we can do to mitigate the damage. Solar flares and CMEs travel at the speed of light, so by the time we get a warning, the storm has already begun. What matters most is how well prepared we are to handle the aftermath. In addition to technological advancements, we also need to raise public awareness about the potential risks posed by solar storms. As it stands, the majority of people have little idea of the potential consequences of a major solar event. Solar weather is still a relatively niche topic, often overshadowed by more immediate concerns like climate change, terrorism, or geopolitical instability. But the reality is that space weather could be just as, if not more, devastating than any of these threats. It's time to start thinking about solar storms not as a hypothetical problem but as an impending global crisis that requires immediate action. We are rapidly approaching a time when solar activity could escalate, and we will need to face the challenges it brings head-on. The question is, will we be ready when the sun finally unleashes its fury? As the possibility of solar chaos grows more pressing, we also have to consider the increased vulnerability of our modernized world. The more we rely on technology and satellites, the more we expose ourselves to the potential dangers of space weather. Everything from electric vehicles to smart grids, even consumer electronics, could face catastrophic failures during a major solar event. The impact of these disruptions would be felt across every sector of society, far beyond just power grids and communications. Take a moment to think about our food supply chains. Agriculture depends on a highly coordinated and delicate system of transportation and distribution, with tons of food shipped across countries on a daily basis. If global positioning systems were knocked out by a massive solar flare, those logistical networks would crumble. Trains, trucks, and ships would have no way to navigate accurately, causing massive delays in deliveries. Warehouses could run out of supplies, and within days, grocery stores would start to feel the effects. The disruptions wouldn't just affect cities. Remote communities that depend on long-distance deliveries could be cut off, leading to food shortages and economic instability in regions we don't often think about. And when we talk about the global economy, it's essential to remember how much financial transactions rely on satellite communications. Banks, stock markets, and financial institutions depend on these systems for real-time transactions and international communications. A large-scale solar storm could throw this entire infrastructure into chaos. Imagine millions of transactions being delayed or frozen. This kind of interruption could lead to widespread panic and trigger a financial crisis that would ripple across markets, affecting economies far beyond the immediate zone of disruption. From investors to everyday consumers, the effects would be felt everywhere. Now, think about healthcare. In a world where remote surgeries, telemedicine, and digital health monitoring are increasingly common, a solar storm could cripple the healthcare system. Hospitals, especially in more remote locations, rely heavily on satellite systems for communication with specialists and remote data storage. Medical equipment, like defibrillators, radiation therapy machines, and MRI scanners, could be damaged by electromagnetic pulses, EMPs, from a solar event. Electronic health records, which have become standard practice in hospitals across the globe, could be lost or corrupted if backup systems aren't properly protected. What happens then? Patients can't be treated. Medications can't be delivered. And emergency services would be stretched thin, trying to deal with a widespread crisis without the modern tools they rely on. And while electricity grids are a major concern, let's not forget the broadband and telecommunications infrastructure. Mobile phone networks, which have become an essential part of daily life, could easily go down during a solar storm. This would cut off people's ability to call for help, access the internet, and communicate with loved ones. Emergency responders would be severely hampered in their efforts to manage a disaster, and the general population could face a communications blackout, adding to the sense of panic and uncertainty. Moreover, the consequences of a solar storm wouldn't be limited to just the immediate effects on technology. Governments would need to respond swiftly, and that means a military presence could be mobilized. Imagine armed forces being called upon to help restore order, provide emergency relief, and manage public safety during what could be a prolonged and disruptive event. The last thing any government wants is to face an event like this without the ability to communicate, coordinate, and control public infrastructure. National security and public health systems would be stretched beyond their limits, leaving civilians vulnerable. While all this might sound like a dystopian future, the truth is we're increasingly dependent on these fragile systems. We live in a world where critical infrastructure is interconnected, and a single failure can have cascading effects. So, what does this mean for the future of humanity? It means we need to rethink our approach to space weather preparedness. It's not enough to just focus on one type of disaster at a time. We need to build resilient systems that can withstand a variety of potential threats, including solar storms. Some experts have called for increased investment in space weather forecasting. More resources should be directed at understanding the sun's behavior and improving our ability to predict and mitigate its effects. Currently, we have solar observatories and space-based instruments that monitor the sun's activity, but these need to be upgraded and expanded. Scientists are working on more advanced models of solar behavior that can predict solar flares and coronal mass ejections further in advance, providing us with better early warning systems. However, predicting the full intensity and scope of these events is still incredibly difficult. At the same time, investing in space weather resilience should become a global priority. That means rethinking the way we design power grids, communication satellites, and space-based infrastructure to make them more resistant to solar interference. These technologies have made life easier, but they also expose us to new kinds of risks. Hardened satellite shielding, more robust electrical systems, and backup communication networks could help mitigate some of the damage from a solar storm. It's also essential for countries to share knowledge and resources when it comes to space weather preparedness. A solar storm doesn't know borders, and it's clear that we need a global response to this growing threat. The timeline for solar storms may remain uncertain, but it's clear that now is the time to act. As we face the peak of solar cycle 25, we must prepare for the possibility that a massive solar storm could be just around the corner. Governments, businesses, and individuals alike must be ready to face the worst-case scenario, because when it comes to solar chaos, there's no predicting exactly when the storm will hit, but we know one thing for sure: the sun won't wait for us to catch up. As we look ahead, global infrastructure and technology networks need to become far more resilient. One key approach being discussed is the hardening of critical systems against solar radiation. This includes everything from power transformers to satellite communication networks. Without the proper shielding, even a medium-sized solar flare could wreak havoc on these systems, causing widespread outages and delays. Power grid operators are already exploring more resilient systems, but much of this work is still in its infancy. Power grids are especially vulnerable, as they rely on large interconnected systems, and a surge in electromagnetic activity could easily lead to cascading failures. Once a small area loses power, it's only a matter of time before the entire grid is affected, leaving millions of people in the dark for potentially weeks or longer. In addition to upgrading power grids, there's also a pressing need to look at communication infrastructures. With our world increasingly relying on satellite-based communication, The risk of a solar event disrupting this cannot be overstated. Satellite constellations are now used for everything from GPS navigation to weather forecasting. If a large solar storm were to hit, it could disable satellites or severely disrupt their functions. In extreme cases, satellites could be destroyed by the intense radiation or the charged particles that solar flares eject. For instance, many satellites rely on delicate microelectronics, which could be fried by a solar flare or an EMP. Without satellites, not only would communications and navigation go down, but weather prediction and even military defense systems could be significantly impaired. Let's not forget that space exploration itself is at risk. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station, ISS, or those involved in future missions to the Moon and Mars, would face considerable danger during a significant solar storm. The radiation levels could potentially be lethal, requiring evacuation protocols and leading to mission delays. In some cases, entire space missions could be postponed indefinitely. The safety of astronauts is paramount, and solar storms present a real threat to any crewed space missions in the coming years. One of the more insidious effects of a solar event would be its cascading impact on supply chains. If solar activity disrupts shipping routes, communication systems, and transportation infrastructure, the consequences could be felt far beyond just a temporary blackout. A global recession could result from such disruptions, as goods, services, and essential supplies simply could not be moved efficiently. Airports, for example, could face delays or cancellations as aviation navigation systems are knocked offline, or the planes themselves could face disruption due to satellite communication failures. In an increasingly globalized economy, this would send shockwaves through every sector, from electronics to consumer goods, and even healthcare. One area that is often overlooked when discussing solar storms is the military's reliance on space technology. Modern militaries use satellite-based systems for everything from communication to reconnaissance. A severe solar storm could compromise a nation's ability to conduct military operations. Satellite-guided weapons, for example, depend on precise positioning data, which could be wiped out in a single solar flare. Moreover, modern naval fleets and air forces rely on satellites to maintain communication and coordination. If these systems were to be taken down, militaries would be forced to revert to older, less effective means of communication, which could drastically slow response times and leave countries vulnerable. Then there's the question of financial systems. As mentioned earlier, our entire financial infrastructure is intertwined with space technology. Stock markets and trading systems rely on timing and real-time data transmitted via satellites. A disruption to these systems could lead to widespread financial panic as the markets struggle to adjust. On top of that, banking systems that rely on satellite links to transmit and validate transactions would be exposed. If communication goes down, transactions would be delayed or even canceled, leading to major disruptions in both local and international economies. Experts in space weather forecasting are working tirelessly to develop better predictive models, but even the best predictions can only give us hours or days of warning before a solar event occurs. The challenge is, of course, that the sun's behavior can be incredibly unpredictable. While we can track sunspot cycles and measure solar wind fluctuations, the intensity of a solar flare or a coronal mass ejection is difficult to gauge until it's already happening. But this doesn't mean we shouldn't be vigilant. The technology to monitor and predict solar events is advancing rapidly. Solar observatories and space weather stations are popping up around the globe, contributing to our understanding of how the sun behaves. One way we can better prepare is by implementing early warning systems and backup power solutions. By building up these backup systems, we can minimize the damage that solar storms might cause. Underground power lines could be one solution to protect local power grids from the surge of radiation, but the cost of doing so is substantial. Similarly, businesses and governments could install solar storm shields on their communications infrastructure to protect satellites and ground-based systems. But there's one area where the average person can make a real difference: personal preparedness. While we may not be able to control solar activity, there are steps we can take to minimize the impact on our own lives. For instance, having backup power generators for emergency situations can make all the difference in the event of a power outage. People should consider investing in solar power systems that can operate independently of the grid and also stockpile essentials like non-perishable food and water. We can also take steps to protect our electronics. There are devices on the market that can help shield electronics from electromagnetic pulses, EMPs, which would be a common side effect of a large solar storm. These simple but effective solutions could keep your devices running and save you from the expense of replacing them after a solar event. Lastly, educating the public about solar storms is crucial. The more we understand about these phenomena and their potential impact, the better we can prepare. Many people are unaware of the risks posed by solar storms, and it's up to scientists, governments, and media outlets to raise awareness and push for the necessary changes in our global infrastructure to make us more resilient in the face of these events. So, whether it's through space weather research, technological upgrades, or personal preparedness, the truth is clear: we are facing a threat that we can't ignore. The sun's unpredictable nature and its powerful forces are always at play. But with better foresight, cooperation, and action, we can ensure that when solar chaos strikes, we'll be ready. The sun might be our star, but we're the ones who need to shine in the face of its power. As we continue to explore the potential risks of solar storms, it's essential to consider how the global supply chain could be affected. With more countries depending on digital systems to track inventory, shipments, and logistics, a solar flare could easily disrupt shipping routes and air freight. Most modern cargo ships rely heavily on satellite navigation systems, which could be rendered useless if a solar storm interferes with satellite communication. And it's not just the ocean freight. Land-based transport systems could be heavily impacted too. As we rely on satellite systems for traffic management and route optimization, a solar storm could cause major delays, wreaking havoc on industries that rely on the timely movement of goods. This wouldn't just affect businesses. It could ripple out to the consumer, leading to shortages and price spikes in everything from electronics to food. Just imagine the chaos that would ensue if, for example, grocery stores couldn't receive shipments for days or even weeks. In the context of agriculture, a solar storm could also trigger a cascade of crop failures. Modern farming practices increasingly rely on satellite weather data to predict everything from the right planting season to the optimal harvesting times. If this data were to become unavailable, farmers would lose their ability to plan effectively, leading to mismanagement, poor crop yields, and ultimately, widespread food insecurity. A global food crisis could result, with nations struggling to import crops from abroad and facing supply chain bottlenecks in the process. Meanwhile, space weather experts continue to advocate for creating a solar storm risk assessment system that can better gauge the potential threat to Earth. The challenge, however, is the unpredictability of these events. As we've seen in recent years, the sun is capable of producing unprecedented solar flares, often without warning. While we know solar activity operates in cycles, each cycle brings with it new unpredictabilities. Some experts warn that the current solar maximum, which began in 2020, could be more intense than previously anticipated. The sun's behavior, as we've discussed, is difficult to predict, and an event as powerful as the Carrington event could catch us entirely off guard. Even though solar storm prediction technologies have improved drastically over the years, there's still a significant gap between early detection and an actionable response. Scientists are working on new models that could give us more lead time, but we're not yet in a place where we can predict a solar storm weeks in advance with the same accuracy that we predict hurricanes or other natural disasters. A major part of the issue is that solar flares and coronal mass ejections can be extremely sudden and are very difficult to forecast with pinpoint accuracy. That said, the space industry is already taking proactive steps to mitigate the risks posed by these solar storms. Satellite manufacturers are implementing tougher standards for satellite shielding, and the satellite insurance market has been evolving to include protection against solar storm-related damages. However, the cost of these measures is high, and not every satellite is equipped with this additional protection, especially smaller, commercial satellites. This is a reminder that space weather isn't just a concern for governments and large institutions. It's also something that affects private companies and the average person who depends on satellite-based services. Moreover, solar flares don't just impact electronics. They can also damage the Earth's ozone layer. The ozone layer is essential for blocking harmful ultraviolet (UV) radiation from the sun. While solar storms might not be able to directly destroy the ozone, they can deplete it over time, leading to higher levels of UV radiation reaching the surface. This could lead to an increase in skin cancers, eye damage, and a variety of other health issues globally. It's a reminder that the impact of solar activity reaches far beyond the immediate damage to electronics or communication systems. On a larger scale, we also need to consider the effects of a weakened ozone layer on our climate systems. The ozone layer plays a key role in regulating temperatures and protecting us from harmful radiation. Without it functioning properly, we might see more erratic weather patterns, contributing to global warming. Droughts, floods, and extreme heatwaves could become more frequent, exacerbating issues like water shortages, wildfires, and food scarcity. This would add a new layer of complexity to our already challenging fight against climate change. Speaking of climate change, the relationship between solar activity and Earth's climate is still not fully understood. Some researchers speculate that increased solar flares could have a cooling effect on Earth, similar to the phenomenon known as the Little Ice Age, while others argue that it could worsen the already dangerous global warming trend. While it's unlikely that a solar storm could reverse climate change, it's possible that a particularly intense event could exacerbate the challenges we're already facing. Our changing climate could also influence solar storm activity. Some theories suggest that shifts in Earth's magnetic field may increase the likelihood of space weather events. Another important area to consider is global security. The military has long been aware of the threat posed by space weather. Historically, military operations have relied heavily on satellite navigation, communication, and surveillance systems. With an increasing reliance on these systems, a solar storm could cripple a nation's ability to coordinate defense efforts, making them vulnerable to external threats. Cybersecurity would also be a concern, as solar storms could damage the communications infrastructure that facilitates military commands and critical cyber operations. And let's not forget that civilian defense systems also depend on satellite technology for a variety of emergency management functions. 911 dispatch systems, fire departments, ambulances, and even search and rescue operations rely on satellites for location tracking and coordination. When these services go down, the effects can be devastating, especially during natural disasters or other emergencies. This has led some to push for solar storm preparedness plans, urging governments to prioritize the development of systems that can withstand space weather phenomena. In the face of all these risks, there's no denying that space weather is something that we can no longer afford to ignore. It may not be as widely discussed as other global threats, but its potential impact is far-reaching and cannot be underestimated. Fortunately, there's still time to take action. Investing in solar storm resilience, improving predictive capabilities, and bolstering global infrastructure will be crucial in minimizing the damage caused by the next major solar event. As we continue to explore space and develop more technological advancements, we must not lose sight of the challenges posed by the very star that makes life possible here on Earth. As we continue to explore the potential consequences of solar storms, one of the most pressing concerns is the impact on the internet infrastructure. In the modern world, the internet is no longer just a tool for communication, it's the lifeblood of almost every aspect of society. From banking transactions and online shopping to social media and critical governmental operations, the internet is a fundamental part of the modern experience. Solar storms have the potential to disrupt this entire system. Undersea cables, which carry a significant portion of internet traffic between continents, are particularly vulnerable to solar-induced currents. These currents could disrupt or permanently damage the cables, causing a global internet outage that could last for days, weeks, or even longer. Imagine a world where global communication is effectively severed. Social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter would cease to exist temporarily. email systems would collapse. Businesses that rely on cloud storage or remote work systems would be brought to a halt. This would lead to economic stagnation on an unprecedented scale, affecting everything from financial markets to international trade. And it's not just the internet itself. Cybersecurity systems, which are intricately connected to the internet, would become vulnerable. With the digital landscape in disarray, hacking attempts could proliferate, as bad actors may exploit gaps in security that are left by disrupted systems. When it comes to power grids, we've already mentioned the risk of widespread failures, but let's dive a bit deeper into just how complex this problem is. Electricity transmission lines act as conduits for solar-induced currents during a solar storm. As these storms increase, the voltage and current on power lines could reach dangerous levels, potentially melting transformers and causing massive blackouts. While some local grids may be able to weather the storm, national grids may not fare as well. If the power grid goes down on a massive scale, the effects would be catastrophic. Hospitals would lose access to critical life-saving equipment, and emergency services would be drastically limited. Traffic lights would go out, leading to potential accidents and chaos on the roads. Even basic necessities, like water treatment plants and public transportation systems, could be shut down, leaving entire cities in disarray. And don't forget about the financial sector. With stock markets and banking systems heavily dependent on real-time data and digital communication, the collapse of the power grid could set off a chain reaction that causes stock market crashes and a global economic recession. Financial transactions would grind to a halt, and without access to credit cards, ATMs, and other payment systems, everyday people would struggle to even buy food or pay for essential services. The ripple effect would be enormous, causing severe social unrest, economic loss, and widespread disruption in societies around the world. One thing that experts have pointed out is that the frequency and intensity of solar storms are on the rise, aligning with the solar cycle. These cycles typically peak every 11 years, but recent solar maximums have shown signs of increased activity compared to previous cycles. In fact, we're now seeing storms with greater magnitude than in the past, meaning that the likelihood of a massive solar flare or coronal mass ejection, CME, impacting Earth is growing. Scientists are closely monitoring the solar activity, and it's becoming clear that, in the near future, we might experience a storm powerful enough to affect the global infrastructure in ways we haven't imagined. Looking further into the future, the technological race will play a big role in how we handle these solar threats. As space exploration continues, countries and companies are increasingly building satellites and space stations that are vulnerable to the same solar radiation. However, there's a growing push to develop space weather monitoring systems that can predict solar storms with more accuracy. While satellite technology has advanced significantly over the past few decades, the idea of protecting these systems from solar flares is still in its infancy. Shielding satellites from solar radiation, improving the materials they're made of, and creating emergency protocols to shift satellites out of harm's way are all areas of intense research right now. But what happens if we fail to prepare adequately? The answer isn't pretty. The global economy could be paralyzed, and the costs of recovering from a massive solar storm could be astronomical. Experts estimate that a major solar storm could cause trillions of dollars in damages worldwide. The recovery process would take years, and we might not be able to fully restore systems to the level they were at before the event. It's crucial to understand that once a solar storm of this magnitude hits, it's not just the technology we rely on, our entire infrastructure could collapse. It could take decades to recover, with long-term impacts felt across every sector of society. It might even set us back in terms of global progress and technology. What's worse is that these risks aren't isolated to just one country or region. The effects of a solar flare or coronal mass ejection would be global, affecting not just industrialized nations, but also the developing world. Those countries that are less prepared, with fragile infrastructure and less robust energy systems, would likely be the hardest hit. For these countries, the aftermath of such an event could be devastating, not only because of economic collapse but because of social unrest, poverty, and health crises. These nations would face the added burden of rebuilding infrastructure with far fewer resources, and their recovery timeline would likely be much longer. What we're dealing with here isn't just a potential inconvenience, it's a threat to global security and human survival. Solar storms may seem like a distant concern, something that only affects satellite systems and power grids, but the reality is that their impact could reach every corner of our world. From the internet to military operations, from financial markets to grocery stores, solar chaos has the potential to change everything. The question isn't whether or not it will happen, but how we can prepare for it, how we can build resilience into our systems and minimize the damage before it's too late. As we continue to understand the potential for solar chaos, the need for action becomes more urgent. It's not just about research and monitoring anymore, it's about building infrastructure that can withstand the next solar storm. We have to look ahead, invest in protection, and put in place systems that can adapt to the increasing intensity of space weather. If we do, we might just be able to avoid the worst-case scenario and ride out the storm when it comes, though one thing is certain, we'll never see the sun the same way again. The energy sector is perhaps the most vulnerable to solar activity. Power grids, as we've already discussed, can experience significant disruptions, but what about the oil and gas industries? Solar storms can also affect oil rigs, refineries, and even pipelines. The interconnected nature of global energy systems means that disruptions in one area can cascade through the entire network, causing fuel shortages, price hikes, and exacerbating the global energy crisis. During a solar event, the risk of electrical fires or mechanical failures in fossil fuel plants increases. Even nuclear reactors are not immune to the damaging effects of solar radiation. Reactor cooling systems, which rely on stable power supplies, could be interrupted, leading to further safety concerns. In addition to this, one of the silent threats posed by solar activity is the disruption of navigation systems. As we continue to rely on GPS for everything from aviation and shipping to personal navigation, even a slight malfunction in GPS satellites can lead to significant safety hazards. Planes might lose their position or be forced to navigate blind, unable to receive real-time weather data or communicate with air traffic control. Ships navigating busy international waters could experience loss of position, leading to collisions or misnavigation, putting thousands of lives at risk. Beyond these obvious dangers, GPS also plays a crucial role in military operations, emergency services, and even the agriculture industry. Without accurate positioning data, crop planting, farming machinery, and even supply chains would be thrown into disarray. But it's not just about what happens in the aftermath of a solar event, it's also about how we as a society can mitigate the damage. Infrastructure resiliency is key to surviving a catastrophic solar event. Some researchers have suggested that power grids should be hardened against solar flares by implementing more advanced grounding systems or by shielding critical components. In places like Canada, where the power grid has already been impacted by solar events in the past, there has been a growing push to install more surge protectors on high-voltage transmission lines. These systems could help distribute the energy from solar-induced currents more evenly, thus preventing the overload that can lead to blackouts. In addition, redundant systems, backup power sources or off-grid solutions, could help maintain critical services in the event of a power failure. Governments must also step up their efforts to address the risks posed by solar storms. Some countries, like the United States and the UK, have begun to invest more heavily in space weather research, creating dedicated programs to study solar activity and its potential impacts on Earth's systems. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, in the US has established a dedicated space weather prediction center that monitors solar activity and provides early warnings of solar storms. These efforts are vital in preventing a full-scale disaster, but as of now, there is still no cohesive global strategy to respond to a solar catastrophe. This lack of a coordinated response is concerning, especially considering how interconnected the world has become. A solar storm's effects on one region could quickly spread across borders, as satellite communication systems, power grids, and internet services are all tied together. A disruption in one area could have a domino effect, leading to widespread economic and social chaos. This is why it's critical that countries not only invest in solar storm preparedness but also in international collaboration. Countries need to share data, research, and best practices for mitigating the effects of solar storms. This global approach could help create more resilient systems and protect populations around the world. Despite the advancements in technology and knowledge, one of the biggest hurdles we face is public awareness. The average person is unlikely to consider the possibility of a solar event affecting their daily life. However, the risks are becoming more pronounced, and we need to take proactive steps to ensure the public is prepared. Governments should be offering public education programs, similar to those for weather-related events like hurricanes and earthquakes, to inform people about how to respond in the event of a solar storm. Additionally, industries reliant on communication, transportation, and energy need to create contingency plans and build more resilience into their operations. The goal isn't just to survive a solar storm, it's to minimize the long-term impact and to recover as quickly as possible. As solar cycles continue, the risks of extreme solar storms will only increase. But there's also hope that, with the right investments, preparation, and global cooperation, we can mitigate these risks. Predictive technologies are improving, and by utilizing better models and satellite data, we can get earlier warnings about the intensity and timing of solar events. This can give us the precious time needed to protect our critical infrastructure, evacuate vulnerable areas, and make sure people are prepared for any fallout. Solar activity is just one of many global threats we face, but the reality is that it's something we can't afford to ignore. The more we understand about the behavior of the sun, the better equipped we'll be to deal with the unprecedented solar chaos that is coming our way. While a solar storm of this magnitude could be devastating, the good news is that it doesn't have to be catastrophic if we take the right steps today. It's all about creating a world where technology and nature can coexist without one devastating the other. So, as we continue to watch the sun's activity with bated breath, let's also take action now to ensure we're prepared for whatever it throws at us. The sun may seem distant, but its impact is closer than we think. And if we're not careful, the next solar chaos might catch us off guard. The time to prepare is now, before it's too late. In many ways, we are entering uncharted territory. Scientists are still in the process of figuring out exactly how these powerful solar events can disrupt modern life. While we understand the mechanics of the sun's cycles, predicting the exact timing and severity of a solar storm is still a complex puzzle. Unlike other natural disasters, like earthquakes or hurricanes, solar storms have the added complication of being driven by cosmic forces that are difficult to model with complete precision. One thing is clear, though, the impact of solar storms is not a one-off event. They have the potential to shake global systems to their core, especially given how much we depend on technology. Satellites in space, which many of us rely on for everything from weather forecasts to global positioning systems, GPS, could be severely damaged by solar radiation. Telecommunications would be disrupted, making it difficult for people to communicate over long distances, while potentially leading to dangerous gaps in our emergency response systems. The question then becomes, how do we ensure that humanity is not left in the dark, quite literally, during such an event? Some experts believe that even small disruptions could trigger cascading effects throughout the entire economy. The sudden loss of power could throw markets into disarray, affecting everything from stock exchanges to banking systems. Without electricity, critical infrastructure, such as hospitals, water treatment plants, and public transportation, would grind to a halt, affecting millions of lives. And let's not forget about the nuclear power plants, which depend on a constant power supply to safely operate. Without backup power systems in place, the threat of a nuclear disaster becomes very real. The financial sector, too, is another at-risk area. Imagine a scenario where banks and stock markets are unable to process transactions because their servers are fried by a solar-induced electromagnetic pulse, EMP. Global trade, already fragile in certain regions, would collapse under the weight of these disruptions. With the global economy intertwined more than ever, Even a localized event could lead to ripple effects around the world. Supply chains could be disrupted, making everything from food to medicine hard to come by. A lesser discussed threat also looms on the horizon: air travel. As solar storms ramp up, the potential to affect aviation systems becomes a pressing concern. Airplanes flying at high altitudes are vulnerable to increased radiation exposure, which could pose health risks to passengers and crew. And the navigation systems that airlines depend on are not immune to solar interference. In fact, even minor glitches in satellite communication could lead to confusion in air traffic control, increasing the risk of accidents or delays. Imagine a world where a simple glitch in GPS forces flights to be grounded or rerouted. It's a scenario we must prepare for, though few people truly grasp how close we are to these kinds of disruptions. Despite all the uncertainty, one thing is evident: the global community needs to act quickly. International cooperation in space weather forecasting has made strides, but there is still so much to do. For example, the European Space Agency (ESA) is working on space weather monitoring systems that can predict when solar storms are headed toward Earth. These systems use advanced satellite technologies to track sunspots and the sun's magnetic fields. By identifying the potential for disruptive solar flares ahead of time, we can send warnings to affected areas and begin taking measures to protect infrastructure. However, these advancements are still in their early stages, and a lot of work remains to be done to refine them. When we talk about global preparedness, we also have to consider the broader question of resilience. In the case of a solar superstorm, not every country is equipped to deal with the aftermath. Some nations have already started investing in solar storm-proof infrastructure, strengthening power grids and securing communication networks. But the reality is that the wealthier nations are likely to fare better than poorer, developing countries. The difference between being able to bounce back after a solar event and facing prolonged chaos often comes down to resources, infrastructure, and preparedness. At the heart of this, though, lies the scientific community's ability to make predictions. Though scientists have made significant progress in predicting when solar activity will ramp up, the true severity of a solar storm's impact remains difficult to assess. Current models for solar storms still have a lot of limitations, and it's hard to know for sure how storms of varying intensities will interact with Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere. Even space weather experts acknowledge that there are too many unknown variables to feel completely confident about predictions. But here's where the potential for innovation comes into play. There is growing interest in developing new technologies that can help us mitigate the impact of solar storms. For example, advanced satellite shielding could protect sensitive electronic systems from solar radiation, while next-generation power grids could be designed to better withstand geomagnetic disturbances. It's not just about reacting to solar storms, but about adapting our infrastructure to ensure that, when they strike, the damage is minimized. And there are also human solutions that could make a difference. Public awareness of solar storms is still in its infancy. Imagine if every household, business, and government agency had an actionable disaster plan for solar-induced power outages. Think about the difference it would make if people knew how to respond quickly to blackouts, how to preserve critical resources, and how to maintain communications in a world where the internet may not be accessible. The power of knowledge cannot be underestimated here. The more we prepare, the less vulnerable we'll be when the sun decides to throw a tantrum. The big takeaway is this: the sun may seem far off, but its influence over life on Earth is undeniable. As solar activity increases, so too does the need for global collaboration, infrastructure upgrades, and resilience planning. This isn't just a scientific curiosity anymore. It's a reality that we must face head-on. Every year, the sun gets more active, and with it, the risks we face grow. But just as scientists are advancing in their understanding of solar phenomena, so too should our efforts to protect ourselves from their fallout. As solar storms continue to become more frequent and intense, the truth is that humanity faces a daunting challenge. The implications are far-reaching, affecting everything from global communications and air travel to emergency systems and the economy. Yet, despite the growing threat, there's still much that can be done. Solar activity has always been part of life on Earth, But as we continue to evolve technologically, our vulnerability to these events has magnified exponentially. However, with proper preparation, innovative technologies, and a global approach to handling these solar threats, we can still minimize the damage. As the scientific community works tirelessly to understand the behavior of the sun, we, as individuals and nations, must also act, investing in protective infrastructure, disaster preparedness, and early warning systems. It's crucial for space agencies, research institutes, and governments to work together to create resilient networks that can withstand the unpredictable nature of solar storms. But beyond just technological advancements, the future of our safety lies in the knowledge we share with the public. Awareness is the first step toward a future where we are not left unprepared when a solar superstorm strikes. So while the fear of massive, widespread disruption is real, we must look at the challenges not as an inevitability but as an opportunity. An opportunity to innovate, collaborate, and ultimately protect not just our way of life but the very systems that keep our world running. In the end, the sun has been a constant force in our lives for billions of years. As much as we may not be able to control its whims, we do have the power to prepare and adapt. With the right mindset and the right actions, we can minimize the devastation from solar chaos, ensuring that when the next solar storm hits, we aren't left scrambling in the dark. The time to act is now, because the next solar flare could be just around the corner. Thanks for tuning in. Stay informed, stay prepared, and let's face the future together.